Emperor Karvax Thor's war carrier broke through the crimson clouds of his home world, its massive engines rumbling like distant thunder across the capital city below. The dragon warlord stood at the observation deck, his obsidian scales catching the light of the twin suns that hung low on the horizon. He hadn't expected to be back this soon. The campaign against the Vrelkian rebels in the outer territories was supposed to take another 3 months, but his forces had crushed the resistance faster than anticipated. Now, as his ship descended toward the imperial courtyard, Karvax felt the familiar weight of rulership settling back onto his shoulders. 200 years. That's how long he'd been building this empire, one conquered world at a time. 40 star systems now bent the knee to his authority, their populations serving his will through a simple and effective system of fear and absolute control. His palace staff was a living testament to this success, representatives from a dozen different species, all of them serving in perfect, terrified silence. That's how it had always been. That's how it should be. The war carrier's landing struts touched down with a heavy thud that shook the courtyard's ancient stones. Karvax dismissed his honor guard with a wave of his clawed hand. He wanted to inspect his household alone, to see for himself that everything had been maintained to his exacting standards during his absence. His majordomo, a nervous creature from the Kelvin system, should have been waiting at the entrance with a full report. The palace should have been spotless, silent, perfect. But something was wrong. As Karvax stepped through the main entrance and into the grand corridors of his western wing, his enhanced senses picked up sounds that didn't belong. His hearing, sharp enough to detect a heartbeat from 3 rooms away, caught something that made him stop mid-stride. Laughter. Not the nervous, forced laughter of servants trying to please a master, but genuine, relaxed amusement. And voices. Lots of them. Talking casually, as if they had nothing to fear. The Dragon Emperor's pupils narrowed to slits. In 2 centuries of rule, his servants had never laughed. They whispered when necessary, responded when spoken to, and otherwise maintained the kind of silence that came from knowing that any mistake could be fatal. This casual conversation, this ease in their voices, it was unnatural. Wrong. Dangerous. Karvax moved through his own palace like a predator stalking prey, following the sounds deeper into the western wing. His claws scraped against the polished marble floors, leaving thin scratches in his wake. The sounds grew louder as he approached the servants' quarters, a section of the palace he'd never bothered to visit before. Why would he? Servants were tools, kept in their designated spaces, performing their designated functions. Their personal areas were beneath his notice. Until now. The sounds were coming from a large common room that had once been used for storage. Karvax could hear at least a dozen voices now, maybe more. He could make out words and phrases that made no sense in context. Someone was explaining something about mathematics. Another voice was asking questions about engineering principles. A third was reading aloud from what sounded like a scientific text. The Dragon Emperor reached the doorway and stopped, his massive frame filling the entrance completely. What he saw inside defied every expectation he'd carried through 2 centuries of conquest. The storage room had been completely transformed. The walls were covered with papers, diagrams, and equations written in multiple languages. His servants, creatures from half a dozen different worlds, were gathered in small groups around makeshift tables. Some were reading. Others were working through problems on datapads. A few were building something with tools and materials that looked like they'd been salvaged from maintenance supplies. And at the center of it all stood Katie, his human maid. He'd bought her from a slave market on the Rim Worlds 2 years ago, just another piece of property to add to his household staff. Humans were considered unremarkable in the greater galaxy, a species that had been conquered quickly and without much resistance. They had no natural weapons, no enhanced abilities, nothing that made them stand out among the hundreds of species that populated known space. Katie had been assigned to cleaning duties in the Western Wing, a job she performed quietly and efficiently without ever drawing attention to herself. But now she stood before a classroom of his servants, teaching them. Actually teaching them, with the confidence and patience of someone who'd been doing this for a long time. She was in the middle of explaining something about resource management when she turned and saw him standing in the doorway. For a moment, the entire room froze. Every servant in the space suddenly remembered exactly who they were and who he was. Fear flooded back into their expressions as they recognized the Dragon Emperor towering in the entrance, smoke beginning to curl from his nostrils, his ancient eyes glowing with barely contained rage. Katie's face went pale, but to Karvax's surprise, she didn't run. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and calmly dismissed her students. "That's enough for today," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Practice what we've covered, and we'll continue tomorrow." The servants scattered like leaves in a hurricane, desperate to escape the Emperor's presence. Within seconds, only Katie remained, standing barely 5 feet tall in front of his 12-foot frame, meeting his burning gaze with those strange, soft human eyes that showed fear but not submission. Carvax's claws extended fully, scraping against the doorframe. His mind raced through possibilities. This was treason. This had to be the beginning of some kind of uprising, some plot that had grown in his absence. Educated slaves were dangerous. Everyone knew that. Knowledge was power, and power was meant only for the strong. Explain, the Dragon Emperor growled, his voice like grinding stone. Explain what you've done to my household, human. And choose your words carefully, because they may be your last. Carvax's mind went to the darkest places first, the way it always did after 2 centuries of ruling through fear and suspicion. This had to be treason. There was no other explanation that made sense. His servants, creatures he'd kept deliberately ignorant and terrified, were being educated by a human. An actual human, one of the weakest species in the known galaxy. The Dragon Emperor's claws extended completely now, each one as long as Katie's forearm, scraping against the stone floor with a sound like metal on metal. Smoke curled from his nostrils in thick gray wisps, a warning sign that any creature in the Empire would recognize as the moment before fire and death. Every instinct screaming through his ancient blood told him that educated slaves were the most dangerous kind. Knowledge was power, real power, the kind that toppled empires and ended dynasties. And power was supposed to belong only to the strong, only to those who could take it and hold it with claws and fire. That was the natural order of things. That was how the universe worked. Katie should have been on her knees by now, begging for mercy, promising anything to avoid the punishment that was coming. That's what any reasonable creature would do when facing down an apex predator who could end their life with a single breath. But the human woman didn't fall to her knees. She didn't beg. Instead, she did something that caught Carvax completely off guard. She walked past him. Not running away, not trying to escape, but actually walking past the Dragon Emperor like she had somewhere to be. "If you're going to kill me," Katie said over her shoulder, her voice shaking but determined, "at least let me show you what I've done first. You can burn me afterward, but you should know the truth before you decide." Carvax was so surprised by her audacity that he actually followed her. This tiny human was leading him through his own palace, through the servants' quarters he'd never bothered to explore, showing him things he'd never cared to see. She stopped at a small room that had been converted into some kind of office, with papers and datapads stacked neatly on a salvage desk. 3 months ago, when you left for the war, your household was running at 62% efficiency, Katie said, pulling up a datapad and showing him numbers and charts. Resource waste was at 40%. You were losing supplies to theft, mismanagement, and simple mistakes because nobody understood the systems they were operating. Accidents in the maintenance sectors were happening every other day because your workers didn't understand the equipment they were using. Carvax stared at the data, his analytical mind automatically processing the information even as his instincts told him to end this conversation with fire. The numbers were accurate. He recognized the reports from his own administrative systems. Katie swiped to another screen. "This is today. Efficiency is at 91%. Resource waste is down to 8%. Accidents have dropped to 1 minor incident in the last 6 weeks." She looked up at him, those human eyes showing no deception. "Your household is running better than it ever has because the people working in it finally understand what they are doing and why it matters." The Dragon Emperor's tail lashed behind him, a sign of agitation and confusion. "You expect me to believe that teaching my servants has made them more loyal? More obedient? Knowledge breeds ambition. Ambition breeds rebellion. This is basic reality. Is it?" Katie set down the datapad and pulled out another set of records, these ones handwritten in multiple languages. "Let me show you something else. Your cook, the one from the Thaxian colonies, used to prepare meals based on fear. He made whatever he thought wouldn't get him punished. Now he understands nutrition, understands how different species process different foods, understands how to create meals that actually help your guards perform better in training. Last week, he figured out a dietary combination that reduced recovery time after combat exercises by 18%. She moved to another stack of papers. Your maintenance crew, the ones who barely knew which end of a tool to use, they've repaired systems that your own Dragon engineers said were beyond fixing. The atmospheric processor in the East Wing, the one that's been running at half capacity for 5 years? Fixed. The water recycling system that kept breaking down? They redesigned part of it and now it runs better than when it was new. Carvax felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Uncertainty. He watched as Katie pulled out more records, more evidence of improvements that shouldn't exist. His servants should have been using their newfound knowledge to plot against him, to find weaknesses in his defenses, to plan their escape or his assassination. That's what made sense. That's what history and instinct both taught. The library, Katie continued, pulling out a thick folder of documents. You have a Vrelkian working as your porter, one of the same species you just finished crushing in rebellion. I taught him to read, to organize, to understand your filing systems. Do you know what he did? He found these. She spread out several intelligence reports across the desk, each one marked with dates from 5 to 8 years ago. Carvax recognized them immediately. They were early warning signs about the Vrelkian rebellion, reports from field agents that should have reached his military command but had somehow been misfiled and forgotten. He spent 2 weeks going through archives that hadn't been touched in years, Katie said quietly. He found reports that predicted the rebellion you just spent 2 years crushing. If someone had read these back then, organized them properly, understood their significance, maybe 3 million people wouldn't have died. The Dragon Emperor stared at the reports, feeling the weight of that number. 3 million lives. 2 years of warfare. Countless resources spent. All because information had been lost in a system run by people too terrified to think beyond their immediate survival. Katie stepped back, her part of the presentation apparently complete. You can kill me now if you want. But everything I've shown you is true and verifiable. Your household isn't plotting rebellion. They're not planning to escape. They're building something here, something they actually want to protect. Because for the first time in their lives, they're part of something that values what they can do, not just what they can endure. Carvax stood in silence, smoke still curling from his nostrils, his claws still extended, but his mind working through implications that challenged everything he'd believed for 2 centuries. Carvax made a decision that went against every principle he'd followed for 200 years. He didn't burn Katie alive. He didn't execute the servants who'd been attending her classes. He didn't shut down the makeshift school and restore the old order of silent, terrified obedience. Instead, he did something far more dangerous and unpredictable. He let it continue. But he wasn't stupid, and he wasn't naive. If this was some elaborate long game, some human trick designed to weaken his empire from within, he would catch it. He would see the betrayal coming and crush it before it could spread beyond his palace walls. So he watched. He watched with the paranoid intensity of a predator that knows it's being hunted but can't quite see the hunter yet. Carvax assigned 3 of his most trusted advisors to monitor everything. They attended every class Katie taught, lurking in the shadows or disguised as servants. They listened to every conversation in the corridors, tracked every movement of the staff who'd been part of the school. They reported directly to him twice daily with detailed accounts of everything they observed. The Dragon Emperor wanted to know about every word spoken, every gesture made, every moment when his servants gathered around this human who was either transforming his household or destroying it from within. Days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Then weeks. Carvax barely slept, spending his nights reviewing reports and watching security footage, searching for the inevitable signs of conspiracy. He looked for secret meetings, coded messages, weapons being hidden, escape plans being coordinated. He knew how rebellions started. He'd crushed 17 of them over his lifetime. There were always signs if you knew where to look. But the uprising never came. Instead, something else happened, something that disturbed Carvax far more than any rebellion would have. His household began to transform in ways that shouldn't have been possible under a system built on fear and absolute control. And the changes weren't subtle. They were obvious, measurable, and completely contrary to everything his experience told him should happen. Brian, his Thaxane cook, was the first one Carvax noticed. The man had worked in his kitchens for 5 years, always keeping his head down, never speaking unless spoken to, preparing adequate but unremarkable meals day after day. He'd been the definition of a broken servant, someone who'd learned that the key to survival was perfect mediocrity. Never excel enough to be noticed, never fail enough to be punished. But now Brian was experimenting. Actually experimenting with food combinations, trying new approaches, testing different preparation methods. Carvax's advisors reported that the cook was staying late in the kitchens, not because he'd been ordered to, but because he wanted to. He was working with Katie to understand the nutritional needs of different species, learning about how various compounds affected metabolism and recovery. The results were impossible to ignore. The Dragon Emperor's elite guards, the ones who went through brutal combat training every day, started recovering faster from their exercises. Injuries that used to take a week to heal were resolving in 4 or 5 days. Stamina was increasing. Performance metrics were going up across the board. When Carvax demanded an explanation from his training master, the answer was simple. The food had gotten better. Significantly better. Then there was Rachel, the Krilthi technician from a species that communicated through clicks and complex gestures rather than spoken words. Her people had been conquered 30 years ago, and they'd been considered barely useful for anything beyond basic manual labor. The prevailing wisdom was that species without verbal language were inherently less intelligent, less capable of complex thought. Rachel proved that wisdom completely wrong. Katie had apparently learned the Krilthi gesture language and had been teaching Rachel engineering principles, showing her how machines actually worked instead of just having her follow rote maintenance procedures. The transformation was startling. Rachel started solving problems that had stumped Carvax's own Dragon engineers for years. The atmospheric processor in the East Wing had been running at half capacity for so long that everyone had just accepted it as normal. 3 different teams of Dragon engineers had examined it, declared it too old and damaged to repair properly, and recommended waiting until it failed completely before replacing it. Rachel fixed it in 2 days using spare parts salvaged from decommissioned equipment. Not only did she fix it, she actually improved it, making adjustments that increased its efficiency beyond original specifications. Then there was the water recycling system. It had been breaking down every few months like clockwork, requiring expensive repairs and causing disruptions throughout the palace. Rachel didn't just repair it. She redesigned a critical component using materials that were easier to maintain and more resistant to wear. The system had been running flawlessly for 6 weeks now, the longest period without failure in its entire operational history. Carvax's advisors reported something else that disturbed him even more than the technical achievements. Rachel smiled now. The Krilthi gesture for happiness, something that involved a specific pattern of hand movements, appeared constantly when she worked. She would arrive at the maintenance bay early and stay late, not because she was forced to, but because she seemed to actually enjoy what she was doing. The Dragon Emperor found himself standing in the shadows of his own palace, watching his servants work with an enthusiasm that fear had never produced. He saw them helping each other, sharing knowledge, solving problems collaboratively instead of each one staying isolated in their own terror. And at the center of it all was Katie, the human who'd somehow figured out what 2 centuries of draconic rule had never discovered. That people who had something to build were more valuable than people who had everything to lose. The war carriers began arriving one by one over the following weeks, massive ships descending from the stars carrying Carvax's generals home from their various campaigns across the Empire. These were dragons who'd served under him for decades, some for over a century. They were the backbone of his military power, the ones who'd helped him conquer and hold 40-star systems through pure force and intimidation. They returned expecting to find everything exactly as they'd left it, the Empire running on the same principles that had guided it for 200 years. They found something very different instead. General Mordax was the first to confront Carvax directly. The old dragon's crimson scales seemed to glow with barely contained rage as he stormed into the throne room without waiting for a formal audience. Mordax had served as Carvax's chief military advisor for over 100 years. They'd fought side by side in the early conquests, had built this empire together from nothing but ambition and fire. If anyone had earned the right to speak bluntly to the Emperor, it was him. "What have you done?" Mordax's voice echoed through the vast chamber, making several servants in the hallways outside scramble away in fear. "I returned from crushing resistance in the outer colonies to find that your palace has been turned into some kind of experiment in weakness. A human, a slave, is teaching our conquered peoples to think for themselves. This is madness, my lord. This is suicide." Carvax remained seated on his obsidian throne, his expression unreadable. He'd known this confrontation was coming from the moment his generals started returning. "You've been speaking with the palace staff, I take it." "Speaking with them? I've been watching them. Observing what this human has done to your household." Mordax began pacing, his claws leaving deep gouges in the marble floor. "Your servants don't cower anymore. They don't fear us the way they should. They gather in groups, they discuss ideas, they question procedures. Do you not see what's happening here? This is how every rebellion in history has started, with conquered peoples forgetting their place and thinking they deserve more than survival." The throne room doors opened again, and 5 more generals entered, their faces showing the same grim disapproval. General Vex, who commanded the Eastern fleets. General Thrain, master of the Southern Territories. 3 others, all veterans of countless campaigns, all loyal servants of the Empire who'd spent their lives enforcing the traditional order. Mordax gestured to them as they took positions behind him, a united front of military power standing against what they saw as a dangerous corruption of everything they'd built. We are not alone in this concern, my lord. Every one of us has seen what's happening here. This human spreads dangerous ideas about equality in education. She makes your servants believe they have value beyond their function. She teaches them skills that should belong only to their masters. She teaches them to do their jobs better, Karvak said quietly, but Mordax wasn't listening. Their jobs? The old general's laugh was bitter and harsh. Their job is to obey. Their job is to serve in fear and silence. That's what keeps an empire stable. That's what prevents the chaos of rebellion. You cannot educate a slave population and expect them to remain slaves. It goes against every principle of nature, every lesson of history. General Vex stepped forward, her silver scales catching the light from the high windows. The dragons are the apex species for a reason, my lord. We are stronger, smarter, longer-lived than any other race in known space. The natural order places us at the top, and all others below. When you blur those lines, when you suggest that a human or a Thaxian or a Krilthi might have something valuable to contribute beyond manual labor, you undermine the foundation of our entire civilization. Thrain nodded in agreement, his deep voice rumbling through the chamber. I spent 3 years putting down a rebellion in my sector. 3 years of warfare because one species decided they wanted freedom instead of order. Do you know how it started? With education. With secret schools and hidden texts and conquered peoples teaching each other that they deserved better than what we'd given them. And now you allow this openly in your own palace. Mordax moved closer to the throne, his eyes locked on Karvak's with the intensity of someone who'd fought beside him for a century and believed he'd earned the right to this confrontation. We demand that you end this experiment immediately, my lord. Execute the human who corrupted your household. Purge everyone who participated in her schools. Make an example that will remind all conquered peoples throughout the empire what happens when they forget their place. Restore fear. Restore order. Restore the natural way of things before this poison spreads beyond your palace walls. The other generals murmured their agreement, a chorus of traditional military thinking that had guided the empire since its founding. They spoke of draconic superiority, of the weakness of lesser species, of the proven methods that had worked for centuries. They painted Katie's school as the first crack in a dam that would eventually break and flood the entire empire with chaos and rebellion. Karvax listened to it all in silence, his ancient eyes moving from one general to another, seeing in their faces the absolute certainty that they were right. They truly believed that what Katie had done was an existential threat to everything they'd built together. And part of him, the part that had ruled through fire and fear for 200 years, understood their position perfectly. But another part of him kept thinking about 3 million dead Vrelkians, and intelligence reports that had been misfiled for years because no one had cared enough to organize them properly. Emperor Karvax made a decision that would define everything that came after. He ordered an assembly of everyone currently in the palace, a gathering that hadn't been called in over 50 years. The message went out through every channel, summoning his entire household staff and every military leader who could reach the capital within 2 days. This wasn't a request. This was a command that demanded immediate compliance. The throne room filled slowly over the following hours. Dragons arrived first, as they always did, taking positions in the upper galleries where their massive forms could overlook everything below. Generals in full ceremonial armor, advisors wearing the marks of their rank, veterans of campaigns stretching back decades. They filled the elevated spaces with scales of every color, crimson and silver and deep bronze, all of them radiating the natural authority of apex predators who'd never questioned their place at the top of the hierarchy. Below them, on the main floor of the vast chamber, came everyone else. The conquered species. The servants. The workers who kept the palace functioning but were rarely seen or acknowledged. They entered nervously, uncertain why they'd been summoned, afraid that this gathering meant punishment was coming for someone. Thaxians stood beside Krilthi, Vrelkians near humans, all the various species that made up the empire's lower classes pressed together in an uncomfortable crowd. Katie stood among them, trying to blend in, trying not to draw attention to herself. But everyone knew. The whispers had spread through the palace like wildfire over the past 2 days. The human teacher. The woman who dared to educate slaves. The one who'd started all of this. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, some sympathetic, some fearful, some filled with an anger she didn't fully understand. Karvax took his position on the obsidian throne, looking out over his empire in miniature. 200 years of conquest reflected in the faces staring back at him. The dragons above, confident and proud. The conquered below, still showing traces of the fear that had defined their existence for so long. But he could see something else too, something new in some of those faces. The ones who'd spent time in Katie's classes, who'd learned to read or understand mathematics or solve problems beyond their assigned duties. They didn't look quite as afraid anymore. They looked invested. The Emperor's voice, when he finally spoke, filled every corner of the massive chamber without him needing to shout. 2 centuries of commanding armies had taught him how to project authority through sound alone. I have ruled this empire for 200 years, he began, letting the weight of that time span settle over the assembled crowd. 200 years of conquest, of expansion, of building something that spans 40 star systems and billions of lives. I have crushed 17 rebellions. I have broken species that thought themselves strong. I have built everything you see through strength and terror, through the absolute certainty that fear is the only reliable foundation for order. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the dragons in the upper galleries. Mordax and the other generals stared back, their expressions satisfied. This was the speech they'd expected, the public execution and restoration of traditional order they demanded. I have believed, as all dragons believe, that we are the apex species because nature made us superior, Carvax continued. That our place at the top of every hierarchy is not just earned but inevitable. That conquered peoples exist to serve, to obey, to live in fear of what might happen if they step out of line. This has been the foundation of dragon civilization for thousands of years. This has been my truth for my entire life. The throne room was completely silent now, hundreds of beings holding their breath, waiting for whatever came next. But 3 months ago, something happened that challenged everything I thought I understood about power and control, the Emperor said, his gaze dropping to the main floor, to where Katie stood among her students. A human woman, a slave purchased from a rim-world market, accomplished something in my household that my claws and fire never could. She made you want to be here. Murmurs rippled through both levels of the throne room. The generals shifted uncomfortably in the upper galleries. The servants on the main floor exchanged confused glances, uncertain where this was going. Carvax rose from his throne, his full height making him tower over even the other dragons present. I watched her for weeks, convinced this was some elaborate conspiracy, some plot that would reveal itself in time. I waited for the rebellion that my generals promised was inevitable. I searched for the betrayal that every instinct told me must be coming. He paused again, letting smoke curl from his nostrils. It never came. Instead, my household became more efficient. My servants became more capable. Problems that had existed for years were suddenly solved. And I began to understand something that terrifies me more than any rebellion ever could. General Mordax stood abruptly in the upper gallery. My lord, this is... Silence. Carvax's command cracked through the air like thunder. Mordax sat back down, but his expression was furious. The Emperor continued, his voice carrying a weight that demanded absolute attention. I began to understand that maybe, just maybe, we dragons have been wrong about something fundamental. We've spent millennia believing that fear is strength, that terror creates stability, that keeping conquered peoples ignorant and desperate is the path to lasting power. And where has it gotten us? 17 rebellions. Countless millions dead. Resources wasted putting down uprisings that keep happening because people would rather die than continue living under our rule. Katie felt tears beginning to form, but she blinked them back, refusing to show that kind of emotion here. The Vrelkian rebellion I just returned from cost 3 million lives, Carvax said, his voice dropping lower. 3 million deaths because an entire species decided that extinction was preferable to one more day of existence in my empire. And I found out, thanks to a porter who learned to read in Katie's school, that the rebellion could have been prevented. Intelligence reports predicted it years ago, but they were misfiled and forgotten because no one in my system cared enough to organize them properly. 3 million lives lost because I built an empire where people only cared about their own survival, never about anything larger.